There we go. So it's recording now. If you don't want to come to the front of the room, that's cool. You can watch from there. I went ahead and started the WebEx app so you can watch from your computer. For those of you who may not remember how to get to that, if you go to the Greg folder under DIGM classes, there's the link. That should take you straight to it. I am going to be showing some stuff in Maya, but I'm going to be talking about some concepts today too. Because today is a weird grab bag of days stuffs. Like I tried to form it into a overarching theme. I just like doing that. It's a writing habit. Like, what is my thesis statement today? Today's thesis statement is all that stuff I didn't fit into other lectures. Not really. It's more like we've been looking at all of this stuff and we've been talking about all this stuff. Some of it needs some reiterating. Some of it needs some emphasis, and then some of it needs some just new lecture. Like there's some stuff that I feel like we've been mentioning, we've been talking about, but maybe just for clarification reasons, we need to talk about that more specifically. So I'm using this next coming project as a way to cover a couple of different topics, and instead of having multiple topics for each, like a different topic for each exercise, right? Instead of doing 3 exercises, we're going to do one project that kind of focuses on 3 different things. So again, you're more than welcome to scoot up to the front if that's if that's what's happening here.
Sadly it wasn't, but
oh, it's all right. You're welcome. Come on. I was excited. I'm like, he wants to hear me lecture. So you're all right. But you're more than welcome to come up and watch, but I'll kind of just chat today. Before I get started, I do want to mention, I'm not that stuff. Here we go. So D2L, I'm working on this. As it's set up right now, this should be how the class is set up. Once I get the whole thing set up, there are actually 2 classes, Maggie. I'll propagate all this stuff out to yours once that's that goes. So, but I'll be pulling this up pretty often in here, and I think the link to these 2 projects and exercise files should still be in there. So in the past, I had project 1 and then exercise 1 in here, and I realized this was going to fill up with this giant list of projects and exercises. And instead what I did is I just started making one giant document. So there'll be one document that has all the projects and one document that has all the exercises, right? So in D2L, under assignments, if you click on projects, this is all of them. Page 1, that was the falling objects, swinging objects. And now we're on to project 3, bob and arm, and we'll talk about that. And you'll see that, that should be 5. And you'll see pretty soon that I think we have 7 projects in here total, and I think 5 or 6 exercises. I have it all scheduled out. I just really want to get all of this written down into one big document, so at any point you know where to go to find that stuff, right? There'll be two locations for it. So this is not that we're going to jump into the project just yet. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I just kind of wanted to talk about that. I've also, I haven't uploaded the image to this yet, but I've kind of changed a little bit of this, right? Oh, did I skip an exercise? So I'm kind of renaming these just a little bit, and instead of table tennis robots, we're doing this a little differently. I realized I didn't want to focus too much on constraints in here, and that would require some constraints. So I'm going to back off, and we're going to kind of change that exercise. That PR3 is now going to be called Bob and Arm, and you'll get to know Bob and Arm very well. For the most part, all the rest of this stayed the same. I think I renamed Robot Flag and Smoke to like Robot Simulation, because I didn't want to make you, force you to do Smoke if you'd rather do a different type of simulation. So, what I'm going to do is after I get all of that solidified and make sure this is exactly when it's going to be, I will make an updated version of the schedule and put it up there to replace this one, or as in addition to this one, so you can just see. But really none of the dates changed. I think the only thing that really changed is I nudged, I think I have a slightly different lecture title for a certain day. Basically what I'm going to do is squeeze a little bit of extra lecture in on one day. This is a long class, and I kind of forget that sometimes. Like, this is a 3-hour class. We can usually fit quite a bit in here. And I think when I was making this schedule, I gave us a little bit too much breathing room on one of the lecture days. So I think we're cool. And walking around the room, I saw a lot of pretty neat stuff. How did y'all like this project, or this exercise? So maybe a little easier in the whole rig. This class, this lecture today, we're going to talk a little bit about that, about using a rig. Sometimes rigs can be intimidating, right? There's tons of different things to control on it. What were you going to say?
Blend shapes, keying them was a nightmare for me.
So that's where a rig.
Each key, like, I know how to find them, but it was like switching back and forth
Between that and moving it. So that's one of the reasons we create rigs, is because Maya sometimes hides that thing we need to keyframe in such a stupid place that a rig just allows you to key all of that in one place. It's actually one of the reasons I kind of had you do this, is so you'll appreciate some of the stuff that a rig can do, but realize that rigging isn't, like, I think a lot of people think, I don't know how to rig, so I can't animate this thing yet, right? Hopefully what you learned today is that, or what you learned in this last exercise is, yeah, you can, it's just a little harder, and that's why rigging is sometimes worth it, is so it makes the animation process easier. And it's really, you weigh that. Like, you weigh the decision of, is it worth taking another hour out of my time and rigging this so I can animate it more easily? Or is the animation going to be something quick and dirty, and I just have to struggle through the animation part a little bit before, to be able to get that same animation, right? Just walking around, some of the things I noticed was probably caused by that. Like, you probably noticed it too, like the arm would swing up and hit the ball, and then half a second later, the ball would go flying forward. Like, it had like a little bit of a hesitation right before the impact. And that was probably because you were busy keying not only the blend shapes, but also the translation of the ball and a lot of that stuff. So you kind of have to remember that all of those things have curves, and what was probably happening is that impact was happening, and then the ball was easing out of that instead of breaking that tangent and making it go fast, right? How many of you used the bend deformer on the stick that hits it? How many of you used bones? Anybody use anything else?
I used a twist.
Twist? Oh, I do remember seeing that. It's kind of got like a little whip to it, doesn't it? So is it a bend and a twist, or both?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was some of mine, but I used the wave on the
Oh, cool. The way, so that's an interesting idea, because like most of that overlapping action happens in a little bit of a wave. So you may be able to use a wave deformer on some stuff. There's a lot of interesting solutions to this. I kind of want to point out there's not a right or wrong answer. Some of you, I think, used a wave or a sine deformer on that object, the little blue target object, right? And then some of you used blend shapes. I'm not going to be like, that's wrong, you clicked the wrong button if you got a good result, right? It's however you get a result it's about the aesthetic of that final result, right? If you literally were animating every vertex frame by frame, like, yeah, that's a hard way to go about it, but if you got a good result, that's what matters, right? It goes on the screen. I call it brute force. Like, sometimes you just have to make Maya do exactly what you want it to do, no matter how much it fights you, right? And so hopefully you got a little bit of practice in that. Today, one of the things we're going to cover is sort of backing away from that a little bit and learning how to use a rig, because one of the biggest challenges most people face in animation is sort of staying organized. Like, your keys are just going to start being like, I don't remember what that key's for. Why do I have so many keys? What do these all do? Right? We're gonna kind of think about that in an organized fashion. So, any last comments on this? Like, stuff you struggled with on this project?
When I was rendering, some reason, like, all of them came out as JPEGs except 3 random frames. They came out as like .iff, and I don't know why. And so then I had to go
He goes,
So
yeah.
what's the lighting glitch in mine, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah. That lighting glitch is, or the IFF file. That stands for, what is it? Image file format. It was a long time ago. I don't really use them anymore. Maya had its own image format, and it was a .iff. The only thing that can open it is this little free program that comes with Maya called fcheck, and you can go digging around and find fcheck and open up the IFF image and save that back out as a JPEG. So that might be one option. But what that sounds like happened is something happened to Arnold and it crashed. Were you running on a render farm? Or I bet Arnold crashed on one of those machines somehow, and so it defaulted to Maya software, and Maya software defaults to IFF. But we just try to discourage you from ever using Maya software, so we never learned to deal with this. Yeah, that's frustrating. Like that's happened to me before too. I'm sure several of you have had that like render farm like. Why did you choose those 3 frames to not render, Maya? Like, why is this one frame darker than all of the other frames, Maya?
When that happened to me, I didn't have a backup. It was just a missing frame.
A lot
Didn't
of
even have an IFF.
a lot of times, what that is, especially if you're rendering to one of these labs, somebody logs on while it's trying to render that frame, and it kills that image, but for some reason won't let it overwrite that image. I think that's what's happening. Some variation of that. Either it killed it and doesn't let it overwrite it, or it killed it and it thinks it was finished. And so you just kind of get this one missing frame that doesn't work.
What was that software you said to use?
fcheck. So FCHEK. And actually, I think if you just type it into the search engine, it's ugly. It looks like yeah, there it is. fcheck. It's this.
Looks like malware.
Doesn't it? Look at that. It's like, it does. But if you can find an IFF file, you can open an image or you can open an animation sequence of IFFs, and it would allow you to see your image sequence, and then you can convert those individual images one at a time or a whole batch at a time. So you can try converting those IFFs. That may fix it. But more than likely, if it switched it to the IFF file format, it probably rendered it with Maya software so that it come out so good. Yeah, that's my guess. But I do. Like we don't use that very much anymore. It used to be like part of my everyday life. Like my wife knew what fcheck was. But my wife knows way more about animation than you think. Like your significant your significant others will as well. They'll be like, oh yeah, FKIK, I know that. Anyway, so any other issues you ran into with this one? How many of you like this one? Got a few reluctant hands. He expects someone to raise their hand. I guess it'll be me. If you did, that means you may like some of the technical part of this, right? If you haven't taken technical direction yet, the way you use some of these deformers, the way you use some of these blend shapes, can be very creative at times, right? So. And so, like, just hopefully this was a little bit of an introduction to some of that, and you'll get a little bit more practice with that in the future. So. Okay, well, let's jump into a couple of things. There's 3 things I really wanted to talk about today before we get into this next project. And the first one is that phrase I just said a minute ago, FKIK. How many of you think you know what that means? You're vaguely familiar. I remember FKIK. So let's just, I know I've asked this before in the past. What's FK stand for? You don't know what it stands for? Does anybody remember what it stands for? Forward kinematics. Kinematics sounds like a word we made up. Maybe we did, I don't know. So we'll talk about what that means here in a minute, but yeah, forward kinematics is FK. Anybody remember what IK is? Katie does. What is it? Inverse kinematics, right? So I mean, it feels like you could have also used the word R, reverse kinematics, right? So it's forward and reverse, right? Or forward and inverse, like so forward and backward, basically is what we're saying, right? And so then that begs the question, well, what's kinematics mean then? Like, what is that about, right? Kinematics just is a way of referring to sort of a chain of command, right? We often refer to this as a hierarchy, and so you are probably pretty familiar with a hierarchy. I have a couple of things here I'll show you in a second, but just to kind of, let's do a new Maya so I can show you in a fresh file. Just to kind of, oh wait, have I not passed this around yet? I did not. Here comes the attendance, everyone. Yeah, sorry, I thought I'd passed that around earlier. So, with any kind of hierarchy chain, we have parent-child relationships, right? So let's do this kind of quickly so you understand. I'm going to create 3 boxes. Right. And a parent-child relationship or a hierarchical relationship means one of those controls the other. If we look over here in our graph editor, or our outliner, we'll see that they're just 3 objects by themselves, right? And I'm sure most of you are already pretty familiar with the fact that the outliner kind of functionally works similarly to any sort of folder structure on your computer, right? That if you were to open up your thumb drive you have in your pocket, you plug it in, you open it up, and you just saw 3 files in there, right? That just means there's 3 files on the root of your thumb drive, right? And that's all that this means here when we look in our outliner. There are 3 objects just hanging out in our scene, no influences at all, right? Nothing is really affecting them, right? It's when that when objects are in folders that hierarchy comes into play, right? I always use music as an example. I don't know if it's applicable as much anymore because some of these people like listen to streaming music, so like Spotify ruined my example. Thanks, Spotify. Actually, really, thanks, Spotify. I love Spotify. But let's say this was still 2003 and you had a thumb drive full of MP3s. Or any other files you may contain and may have in your folders, right? But let's take music as an example because I think it's a good example. Let's say you're a huge fan of a specific musician. Who's a musician you're a fan of or band?
But I have so many I can't tell you.
Well, we got one vote for Coldplay. I didn't realize they were still doing stuff. That's cool. I don't know. Like they were doing stuff when I thought that they were cool, so I just assumed you all didn't, right?
Shinedown. Shinedown's good.
Shinedown. I don't know.
System of a Down.
Huh?
System of a Down.
System of the Down. Oh yeah. This is like this is actually interesting. Now I want to know what you all listen to. Yeah. Let's go ahead and use Coldplay because I know they have a handful of albums that I'd say a majority of people are familiar with. How many of you actually like Coldplay or have an album of them? See, this is what I get for using music as an example. Okay, let's say you on your hard drive you have a folder full of Coldplay albums, right? Actually, you have a folder that's like MP3s, it's all of your music or whatever. And then you have the Coldplay folder, right? And under that Coldplay folder is a folder for each of the albums. What's a couple of the albums? So Rush of Blood to the Head, is that another one? Huh? X and Y, okay? So you at least have those 2 folders, right? Now, anybody need the attendance sheet? It's still floating around? All right, everybody is here. You all are very good with attendance, good job. So you recognize that if you were to grab that, let's say one of your friends is like, I've never heard Coldplay before. I would like to hear that music. And illegally, you're like, I'll give you all of their songs. And so, and so what you do is you copy that entire Coldplay folder onto somebody else's hard drive, right? When you copy the Coldplay folder, all of those albums that are underneath it go with it, right? And so like this works with anything. All those album folders go with it, and all of those MP3s that are in those album folders go with it. But what if your friend said, you know what, I don't have that much room on my hard drive, just pick out your favorite song. What's your favorite song? Oh, and I'll put you. How about Scientist?
Yeah, I was about to say this.
So you pick out Scientist and you're like, I'm just gonna give you that one. That's the one I'm gonna give you. And you grab that one MP3 that's under all of those folders and move it over. What happens to the rest of those MP3s? Nothing, right? Like you didn't mess with them, right? So if you grab the entire folder, all of those MP3s that are under it go with it, right? If you grab just one MP3 that is in the lowest folder and move it, nothing happens to any of that other structure, right? And you're very familiar with that folder structure. You probably are very familiar with that folder structure setup. And so that's all a hierarchy is, right? With this, I have p cube 1, p cube 2, p cube 3, right? And right now, if I move p cube 1, nothing happens to any of the others. If I move p cube 2, nothing happens to any of the others. You kind of understand this, right? Now, if I were to drag p cube 2 on top of p cube 1, I have to do this with middle click, right? So if I middle click drag on top of p cube 1, now you'll see this is starting to work like a folder structure, right? p cube 1 is there, and if I move p cube 1, p cube 2 goes with it, right? And that's because it's a parent to it, right? The theory to this parent-child relationship is that the parent leads the child wherever the parent wants to go. The child doesn't get a say about that, right? If the parent lets go of the child's hand, it's going to go anywhere it wants to go, right? and so that's sort of the relationship, right? Is that top-down hierarchy. The parent controls the child. Huh?
Did you just make this sound wrong?
Did I make a what?
The parent dragging the child around is like, I did not think of that before.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you probably shouldn't drag kids. Like, just life lessons. But at Walmart, like, hold its freaking hand. Come on, people. Like, how many kids do I have to, like, almost run over? Hold the hand at Walmart. The end. And so we have this now that if I move p cube 1, p cube 2 goes with it. What if I try to move p cube 2? What happens to any of the others? Anything? So nothing should happen because it's not affecting anything else, right? Now I can move it way down here, right? And so it's down here now, but if I go back and move p cube 1, it's still going to move it with that offset, okay? So what we've kind of done is changed its container, changed its world space, is what we call that, right? Or changed its space, not necessarily world space. And I kind of like to think of it like, let's do thought experiment here, right? Let's say I had this giant cardboard box, and inside that giant cardboard box was another little bitty person, okay? Now, if I'm walking around with that cardboard box and that little bitty person is in that box, the world that that person is in, that box, is going to go everywhere that I go, right? Within that box, though, that person can run around wherever they want to. And if they have a tiny box with another tiny person in it, it just keeps it embedding in it, right? It's a very creepy thought experiment. You'll all have bad dreams tonight. Maybe like tiny people in boxes. So that's how this works, right? When I made this a child of p cube 1, now it's under its control, right? And so if I made p cube 3 a child of p cube 2, right? If I just middle click that and drag it on top of p cube 2, we just start getting this like nesting doll effect, right? I move this one around, all three of them go. I move this one around, those two go. I move this one around, that one goes, right? We can keep stepping back up, right? So that's how hierarchy works. I think you already know that, but it's worth like having that fresh in our brain when we start talking about kinematics, because all this is a chain of command, right? Now, a handful of you said you decided to use joints or bones or whatever inside of Maya. I can never remember. Maya calls it joints, right? Max calls it bones. So you decided to use joints in this. All a joint is this chain of command with a visual representation, right? Some of you probably already recognize I can make a group, like Control G. Look at that. I have this empty nothingness there, right? And it's just a pivot point, right? There's nothing there. It's just a pivot point in space. And I can duplicate that 3 times. And now I have 3 pivot points in space that all have different locations, and I can parent those together, right? And even though I have this complex chain of command there, really all I have is like these 3 invisible objects. That's actually all a joint is. It's 3 non-renderable objects that you can parent together. But this is confusing, so joints have some form of visibility in our viewport so we can see them, right? And some sort of way of seeing what that chain of command is. And when we're talking about kinematics, that's what we're talking about, is that chain of command in a series of pivot points that we would use to create joints, right? So you'll notice that if I go, here my top view, I go to my rigging tool set, skeleton, create joints. When I start creating them, I create the first one. It's just a joint, just like any other object in our outliner. And as I keep clicking, all I'm really doing is making this chain of command, right? All these are pivot points in space with some sort of visibility, right? So this is a hierarchy chain, right? Joints are a hierarchy chain. When we're talking about FK and IK, it is in reference to the way that hierarchy affects the parent-child relationship, or a way the parent-child relationship functions, right? So currently, if I rotate joint 1, right, all of those other joints go with it. And if I rotate joint 2, everything below joint 2 goes with it, but joint 1 doesn't, right? And if I rotate joint 3, no. So if I go all the way down to this end joint and I move it, the only thing that's being affected is that end joint, right? Now, IK means the opposite of that. Instead of the highest thing in the hierarchy being in control of that chain of joints, the end effector, the end of that chain of joints, will be in control of the way that entire system changes or moves, right? So to give you an example of that, let me create a cleaner set of joints here. Skeleton, create joints. So we have this chain again. FK means that it's going to affect on down the chain. But if I go in here to skeleton and say create IK handle, click on the top one, the highest chain, and then the last one, now I get this little bitty IK handle here, and my move tool is at the end of that chain of command. So when I move the end of this chain of command, it controls the entire system of joints, okay? It's inverse because it's inverse to how you would think of this working. It's as if you grabbed that Coldplay song and your entire hard drive gets copied over to somebody else's computer, right? We usually don't want a hierarchy to work that way, but we need it to function this way because human beings and other living creatures function this way, right? If you think about how we move, my arms are currently moving in FK, right? And the way you can tell that is the highest point in this chain of command is working down the line, right? I rotate my shoulder first. My pinky finger doesn't get a choice. It doesn't be like, no, I'm going to hang out down here while you're wagging around, right? It has to go with my arm. It's connected to it, right? That's the way things function. If I rotate at my elbow, it's not going to affect my shoulder as much. I mean, it is just because I can't hold it completely still, right? But my pinky still has to go along for the ride, right? However, if I get all the way down there to the end and I wiggle my my pinky around, I can't do it without also wiggling my ring finger. If I could, that'd be really cool. Like I feel like it'd be like a party trick. You'd be like, hey, watch this. I can wiggle my pinky finger and nothing else moves. That doesn't affect my shoulder, right? So that's the end of it. So why would we ever need that inverse relationship? Why do we need IK? It has to exist for some reason, right?
So, like when we did the walk cycle, we did an IK handle, and I think it made the animation easier because you could put like the input where you wanted it to go, and didn't have to worry about positioning each joint exactly where it looked like it would be right. It kind of just fell naturally into place.
Right. So we did that in the principles class by making IK for the legs, and what that meant is you could move the character's hips around, and the feet stayed on the ground, right? Otherwise, whenever the character's hips were bouncing up and down like this, right, you would have to counter animate the feet in FK to keep them in the right place. So think of it this way. I'm holding onto this chair, right? This chair is pretty steady. And sometimes when I walk around this chair, I want my hand to stay there, right? And I'm going to walk around and say different things like this, right? But I need that hand to always stay locked in that place, right? That's how IK works. I can lock that IK to this chair, and it stays there, and the rest of the system sort of figures out for it, right? If that weren't the case, how we would have to animate that is, as I move my chest, my hand would move, and then I would have to rotate it back and try to get it back in that exact right spot again. And then when I move my chest again, my hand would move, and I'd have to rotate it back. It would just be a pain in the butt. We call that counter animating. You have to go back and unanimate the animation your rig did, right? You have to counter that action. And so IK prevents you from having to do that in areas where the end of your hierarchy is often locked to things. Your feet and your legs are the most common areas where that happens, right? There's very few times in your day where your feet are not on the ground in some way or another, right? If you're laying down, yeah, you can kick your feet up in the air and they'll move in, FK or whatever. But most of the time when your feet are on the ground, they're locked there and you want them to stay there. You don't want them to swim around all over the place, right? So why not just use IK? If IK is so great, and it's very easy to pose, right? You remember animating that walk cycle with the character. Why even worry about FK? Why shouldn't all chains be IK?
Maybe there are things we really need to move independently of like the main body. Maybe.
Other ideas?
Because in the same sense that you're counter animating with FK, if you have IK on everything, you have to reposition. Like if you're moving the hip, you have to reposition the foot to come up with it and reposition the knee. But if it's FK, then it will move accordingly naturally.
I think you're both on the right idea. Let me show you this as an example. I'm going to animate two different things, one using FK and one using IK. Okay? Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. So we have this one here. It's rigged with IK, right? And so I'm going to go from something like this. Do I get to rotate that? What does that do? Anything? So maybe something like this, right? To sort of straight back out again. I'll just sort of zero this out, right? So 30 frames, 30 frames. I'll go ahead and make something similar with this one, right? I'll go ahead and rotate. Oh, wait, sorry, I forgot how I had this rigged up. Let me undo that. We'll do this differently. This is the one I'm going to animate. So I'll animate, say, from here down to back to 0 again, right? And so you'll see from those two keyframes, that's what we're getting, right? Let me do the opposite with this one, right? So again, this is my end frame on frame 30. I'll go ahead and set my keyframes where everything's perfectly straight, right? And then up here on frame 1, let's go ahead and bend this pretty drastically. I just try to see if I can mimic a similar pose, right? Maybe like that, right? So it's not perfect, but close. And so we have these same two poses, right? Now, just to stretch this out a little bit. I should have made this a little longer. So those are the same two poses, two different types of rigs. You would assume that they're going to move the same way, right? But let's hit play and watch what happens with them. Playback speed real time. Okay. So one of the 12 principles is arcs, right? So when we're animating rotation, by default, we get arcs. Right? If I'm just animating the rotation of my shoulder, the tip of my finger is going to travel in an arc. IK, we're not animating rotation. We're animating translation. I set a keyframe for one pose, I set a keyframe for another pose, and it's going to translate between those 2 points. What's the shortest distance between 2 points? Straight line, not an arc, right? So if we were to go in here and sort of track these points, let me do this. I'm going to extend out all my joints, grab that end joint, grab that end joint, and I'm going to go to animation, visualize, create editable motion trail. You can see the two different paths the end of that takes. Right? FK by itself, just by rotating, by setting 2 keyframes, I get an arc out of that, right? Actually, if you think about it, all living creatures, their primary motion is the result of rotation, not translation, right? Your legs, no matter how they're walking around, when they're up in the air, you're rotating at your hip, you're rotating at your knee, your arm is the same. Almost all of our actual skeleton is made up out of sockets and joints, right? And the way we move that around is our muscles pivot at those points. They rotate, right? And so arcs is one of the 12 principles, right? We want to get more arcs out of there. Now that doesn't mean that either of these are wrong. It means that if you're going to use IK, you have to be conscious of the fact that your objects are going to try to move in straight lines. And that's because Maya is just a fancy calculator, right? It's calculating those 2 points of data I gave it, and it's taking it in a straight line, right? If I wanted that to move in an arc, that means I need more keyframes on this, right? Somewhere in between frame 1 and 95, I need to go in there and put an extra keyframe. Maybe move this over to here, hit S. I hate that. There we go. And so now I get a little bit more like this. So it's closer, right? If I keep adding this, right? Maybe here. And so little bits at a time, I'm getting a little bit more of an arc out of this, right? And I just got to kind of go in there and make it move in the arc that I want it to move in, right? And so I was able to get an arc, but really kind of what I'm doing is I'm just adding enough keyframes that my straight lines start to look like arcs, right? And like we just have to subdivide that enough to where we can get an arc. Right? I show you this because you kind of have to be informed about this on what you decide to use. Most character rigs are going to come with the option to either use FK or IK for multiple parts of the body. Right? You will have an FK or an IK arm, and you have to ask yourself, do I need this to be an FK or do I need this to be an IK? And sometimes the answer is both. Right? So sometimes you have to transition between both, and that gets really frustrating. Right? So my character is walking around, waving their arms in these elaborate arcs, and then they come to rest on this bottle here and while they're talking, and like that arm has to stay locked there, right? So I'm either going to animate a lot of elaborate arcs in IK and fight with that, or I'm going to do an FK-IK switch, which is part of your rig, right? Don't worry about the switching right now. What we're mainly going to be focusing on is sort of practice and animating an FK and an IK. Questions? Comments? Okay. In TD, technical direction, you're going to get a lot more practice in how to set these two things up. So don't sweat that. I'm not going to make you rig anything today. We're going to animate some stuff. All right. The other two things I wanted to talk about today are not necessarily full lectures. They're things I want you to focus on while you're working on this next project, right? What many of you are probably experiencing when working with any of this stuff is kind of like keyframe overload, right? Anybody fighting that? Like where you're like, there's just a bunch of tick marks across my timeline, and I don't know what any of those mean, right? And I recognize very early on, like, there's a couple of things happening here. You are still kind of fighting with the program a little bit, right? This program has not completely made the transformation into this invisible pencil that you can use, right? You still have to think about the software a reasonable amount, and that's, when we open up the graph editor, it can be a little confusing, all of that stuff. Eventually, some of that goes away, and you can just focus on the animation, right? But that's the way we kind of treat this is actually going way back into the sort of foundational ways that animation was developed, which is again one of the 12 principles: pose to pose and straight ahead action. Do you remember those two?
Straight ahead.
Straight ahead. So it was kind of one of the principles was just called pose to pose and straight ahead. So actually, give me 1 second here to find this video. Okay, let me see if I have audio. So, yet again, I'm going to let YouTube do my job for me. We're going to go ahead and watch this just as a reminder, and then we're going to talk about how we implement that into 3D animation. So, let's skip that.
This video is based on the 12 principles of animation as described by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Alright, so the fourth animation principle is called straight ahead and pose to pose. This term describes two methods used to animate drawings. The first method, straight ahead, is where you draw the first drawing, and then you draw the second drawing, and then the third drawing, and so on. It's basically animating as you go. The second method, pose to pose, is where you draw the beginning and end of each main pose and go back later to fill in the drawings in between. So there are benefits to both methods. Pose to pose is generally better for most actions because it gives you the most control. You have a good idea of what the action is going to look like very early in the process. So instead of worrying if the character is going to end up in the right place, you decide where they end up from the beginning and work backwards. Also, using straight ahead animation can lead to the character changing size or being on a different level from beginning to end. Pose to pose can save you a lot of work. If you were to animate a whole sequence straight ahead and then realize that one pose is off, you would have to change several drawings to fix that one pose. But with pose to pose, you do the main poses to see if it feels right, and you can catch problems early on. Straight ahead animation, on the other hand, is good for animation that is unpredictable. Some examples of this include fire, water particles, clouds of dust, explosions. The reason why straight ahead works well is because there are laws of physics that work at a constant rate, and it's hard to predict how it will work pose to pose. So when animating fire, for example, you just go with the flow based on what you know about fire, and let the fire kind of create itself. If we were to look at the beginning and end, we wouldn't even know how to in between it. However, you can still use pose to pose to make the general shapes and fill it in between to make it smoother. Another example of unpredictable animation is overlapping action, which will be covered in depth in the next video. Let's say that a character has floppy ears. You could draw the figure with his ears for each pose and just draw the in-betweens accordingly, but another method is to animate the figure using pose to pose without the ears, and then going through and adding the ears using straight ahead. This is good because you can focus on the figure's movements without the distraction of having to do his ears, and you can also focus on the physics of his ears without the distraction of his body's movement. This also applies to hair, tails, and other appendages. When you work pose to pose, there's some vocabulary that goes into it. There are main poses called keys, secondary poses called extremes, and further broken down poses called breakdowns. Make the keys first, perfect them, then decide the farthest the character will go in each direction using extremes, and then decide how you want the extremes to connect using breakdown poses. At this point, you can start in-betweening. Working with this sort of hierarchy will give you the most control as opposed to doing your pose to pose straight ahead, so to speak. This is like pose to pose within pose to pose, because you are perfecting the poses at each level before moving down to the next level. So that's all I've got for straight ahead and pose to pose. The next principle is called follow through and overlapping action. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
So, that's great if you're doing 2D animation. I kept talking about drawings. What's he talking about? You're not drawing anything, right? This is important because the way you should think about your animation is still as a drawing, right? Because when it comes down to it, your audience is just going to see a bunch of pixels, right? They're not going to see your rig. They're not going to see that skeleton that's driving the rig. They're just going to see a bunch of pixels. That's the thing that communicates, right? It's like when you're writing a paper, like they're not going to see your outline. They're not going to see any of that. It's just what comes out the end, right? And what comes out the end isn't that much different than a bunch of hand-drawn animation, right? And so we can start thinking very early on in that pose-to-pose method. And the way to do this, and I strongly encourage, is there a stronger word than encourage that's not enforce? is there somewhere in between? Endorse, whatever. The method of using pose to pose in the majority of the things that you animate, right? So, so if we were going to animate this arm, right? Let me go ahead and hide some of this stuff here. Control H, right? So if we were going to animate, sorry, let's see the joints. And there we go. So we're going to animate this arm in sort of a pose-to-pose way, right? The biggest key drawings are our keyframes, right? And so let's just go ahead and wipe all of this out and just show you what I'm talking about here. Delete those keyframes. All right, go ahead and hide that. I can grab these three controls, right? And again, I'm grabbing all three of them. So I'm grabbing every control that allows me to manipulate this rig, okay? That's frustrating to some people because I'm going to start setting keyframes on all sorts of stuff even if I don't move it, right? I'm just going to dump keyframes into this thing like I don't care, right? And it's going to make for a lot of keyframes that aren't actually doing anything, right? So for example, right now, I can, if I hit S on this, right, I definitely want some keyframes on that rotate, right? But I also just set keyframes on all of my scales and all my translates, right? Even if I'm not going to do anything with them. I'm doing that for a reason. Actually, let me go back and do that on frame 1, so it makes more sense. The reason I'm doing that is because now I know that nothing can screw up that pose for me, right? That pose, I am in command of that, right? If I go out, so let's say I go out here later, right? I curve this in here, like whatever. I'm making whatever pose changes I want to, right? I know that no matter what, if I go back to frame 1, it's always going to be that thing I told it to be, right? It's not going to change. That's what frame 1 is going to look like. Now, the reason that's important is because occasionally you will, especially if you're using auto key, you will make a change to something and not realize you didn't key everything, right? So let me kind of show you an example here. Move this out here where we can see it by itself, right? And so let's say I am going to set S right there for that keyframe, right? And then I'm going to go out here to frame 50, right? And I'm going to move my object forward and translate X. And I'm like, I like that. That's where I want that to be on frame 50. But I didn't key everything, right? I didn't key my translate Y. I didn't key my translate Z. So I go out here to frame 80, and I say, you know what? I want this to be up here and over here on 80, right? So now I have a keyframe on translate X on 1, 50, and 80, but I don't have a keyframe on translate Y. So that means that that keyframe I thought was perfect earlier is now broken, right? Because I didn't nail everything down. I didn't say, I'm in control of all of these channels, and that's where I want all of those channels to be. So that's why we are doing this pose-to-pose method, is that I key all of that, and I'm in control of that keyframe at all times. Like it sounds very like grandiose, puppet master, I must control everything. But I do. I have to control everything because I am the animator. Maya is not an animator. Maya is a tool an animator uses, right? And so I'm going to be in complete control of this rig for all of my keyframes. It's actually in this file. Which means to do that, I have to, like, oh man, I hate when that happens. Which means to do that, I have to set a keyframe on everything, right? But what that means is that that's a lot more information, and that can start feeling overwhelming, right? The first thing that a lot of people have a tendency to do is like let's say you set 2 keyframes, right? You do frame 1, and then out here on frame 80, you're like, I'm going to curve it way up like this, right? Yay, I got a new keyframe. I have my 2 key poses. I have frame 1, I have frame 80. The problem with that is those other 78 frames, Maya's doing whatever it wants to it, right? And what happens is that a lot of times people will start scrubbing between that, and they're not paying attention to the keyframes, they're paying attention to all that other stuff we haven't defined yet, right? And they're finding things that are wrong with that, right? So if I wanted to make this look like it had some overlapping action, and I started scrubbing, like the first thing I see is, oh wait, that's wrong, that's not what that's supposed to look like, this is supposed to be down here. Is that looking better? Oh, that's looking better, but now this looks wrong, this is supposed to be over here, right? And I scrub, is like, that looking better? Oh, that's wrong. This is supposed to be over here. Oh, this is supposed to be over here. And then when I look at it, I got all of these keyframes that are all over the place, right? Because I'm just like setting keyframes willy-nilly based off of my like whim, right? I see something that looks wrong and I immediately change it and I change it and I change it. And eventually I have all of this data I can't keep track of. My brain isn't that big. Most people, like on average, can memorize about 5 numbers. And you may think that's not right because you can memorize phone numbers. That's why we break numbers up into groups of 3 and 4. Is because most people can't remember a string of 6 numbers without breaking it up into 2 groups of 3. So what makes you think you can remember 120 different keyframes? Right? We can't. So what we're going to do is we're going to think of them in 2s at a time. Right? If I wipe out all of those keyframes in the middle, right, and I just look at my 2 keyframes, I can make sure those are perfect. And the way I can skip back and forward from these is the greater than and less than keys. So if I go greater than, less than, or well, less than, greater than, back and forth, right? I'm not going to worry about any of that stuff in between. I'm just going to worry about those 2 keyframes. And if that keyframe is off, I will change that. I'm going to think of these in the same way I would think about drawings, right? Just like you don't start drawing the pinky finger of every in-between before you finish drawing the character, right? I'm thinking about these 2 big drawings, frame 1 and frame 80, okay? These are our keys or our extremes, depending on the verbiage you want to use for it, right? Something that, if I'm doing this, right, then now I just take another decision. It's like subdividing the things I have to think about into manageable chunks, right? So this next manageable chunk that I need to decide is how do I get from here to here? In keyframing terms, this is our breakdown, right? How do I break that motion down, right? And so what I may do is halfway in between here, decide if that looks right. So I'm just going to pick frame 45 to make my new keyframe. Does frame 45 look like I want it to look for this transition? So what I can do is select all of that, and again, using the greater than, less than keys, just step through that. Like it's like a flip book, right? Frame 1, 45, there. And I'm like, no, I want that to look like it's dragging more. So this key pose, just this drawing, I'm going to make some changes to it, right? I'm going to maybe make that go up a little higher. I will make these 2 drag behind. Maybe I want this one to drag behind a lot, right? Set all that, hit S. And again, if I start dragging, I'm going to find mistakes, right? I'm just going to look at these 3 drawings because we can understand that as motion. So I'm actually really liking that breakdown now, but the difference between there to there is huge, right? I need to see something in here that makes sense to me, right? So maybe what I'm going to do is find halfway in here, right? And I'm going to go ahead and set a keyframe. Maybe I'll have this overshoot, but I'll still have these 2 kind of dragging behind a little bit. And so I have 4 keyframes now, and that's all I have to think about. The 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Now the problem with that is you want to hit play, right? Like it's like this like itchy finger. I gotta hit the play button. I gotta hit the play button, and then you hit the play button, and it's kind of all off, right? It's a little slow, whatever. It's really hard at this stage, or any stage really, to hit that play button and see the good parts without seeing the bad parts, right? But the parts you've been working on are just those 4 keyframes, right? If we keep subdividing this, it will get better if you trust that process. So what we are going to do is, just so I don't look at all of that broken stuff in between, I'm going to set this to where I only see the keyframes, okay? So what we can do is I can right-click on my timeline, and up here, enable stepped preview, okay? Now when I click that, it doesn't really look like anything changed, but now if I hit play, it's only going to play my keyframes, okay? If we look in our graph editor, what this temporarily does to our graph is actually kind of neat. Animation, what's happening? It's not showing it. Huh. I thought that it set this to this. So our curves are actually, yes.
On the WebEx, it's like glitchy, because it's like part of it's frozen, but I see the mouse moving. It's really weird.
Is anybody else is doing that?
Mine's just frozen.
Mine's frozen.
Why don't, let's try this. Where is my WebEx?
I don't know if it's like how it's going to be recording. I just wanted to make sure the video would look good for later.
Is that working better now?
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. I just went ahead and canceled it and restarted it. It's probably a network speed thing. So the video I'm recording, I'm not recording with WebEx, I'm recording with OBS. So hopefully it'll still be smooth, just the broadcast. But thank you for letting me know. Like, always let me know stuff like that. So now I have these stepped keys, right? That's what this is called. Strangely, it's not showing them the way I thought it would. In previous versions of Maya, really what it's doing is it's making changes to your graph editor, but not showing it to you in the graph editor. What these keys are really looking like to Maya isn't these smooth curves. They're looking like this right here. This button right here will turn them into stepped mode, right? So if I look at any of my rotations, it's staying completely flat until it gets to that next keyframe, and then it's popping to it, right? This must be new in this version of Maya. In the past, it would temporarily convert your view here to where you would see it as if they were in stepped mode. It's not really it's not really doing that. It's not really changing your curves. It's just changing the way it plays back in your viewport as if your curves were in stepped mode, right? So what this means is I can go in here and start adding more keyframes and just think about the key poses. I will say that in more complex rigs, sometimes this enable step preview doesn't work very well, like it breaks parts of the rig. And so if that's the case, you can always go in here and set all of these keyframes to stepped and still get the same result. So again, the reason we're doing this is so we'll just focus on our key poses. A lot of animators I know for character animation, they won't even animate out on their timeline. They'll just make a timeline that's 10 frames long, and pose 1 is on frame 1, and pose 2 is on frame 2. Even if that transition takes half of a second or 2 seconds to happen, they're just defining their poses on consecutive frames, and then they start moving those out into the timeline to get their timing as a separate pass. I can show you that method. Works well for some people, other people hate that. Step preview is a really nice way of still kind of getting some of your information there, right? So let's say I wanted to do an anticipation before this, right? Again, even if all I wanted to do is an anticipation just from the top, I'm going to set a keyframe on everything, right? Grab everything and hit S. And what we're going to get is now just a little bit of a, anticipates back and then starts moving forward, right? I don't really want to do it just on the top though. I never want to just move one thing. Take a little bit of this. I'm going to have it anticipate back quite a bit. Maybe a little bit like this. So now what we get is this slow anticipation back and then that quick pop forward. So that pop forward is maybe a little fast. I can still shift my timing here. And what I want to do is somewhere in between here, I'm going to make another keyframe, start to move forward, start to drag back. So let's see what that looks like. So the cool thing about this is it takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to how this looks when you watch it. but you also kind of know exactly when you're hitting those keyframes, right? And so to me, like, this from here to here is just taking way too long, right? Maybe I'll pull that back like that. Same with that. And then I kind of feel like I need a settle pose here. That's where I get. A little bit. Now, sometimes if you ever watch me animate, you'll hear me do something that's kind of annoying, which I'm like, I want to make sure I set a keyframe on everything. So I just use the greater than, less than, and S keys to just make sure everything has a keyframe, right? It's because sometimes like, I don't remember if I hit S or not. I want to nail it all down. Like, that's important to me because now I am in control of as much of this as I can be at this point, right? And I'm doing that just by thinking of my keys here, right? Like, I'm only thinking of these drawings that go into making this animation, right? So from here, I can just keep subdividing, right? If there's something not right, if I turn this off and watch it, if there's something not right in one of these transitions, right, I can just add another subdivision or rework my timing, right? So for me right now, like that right there to there, right there feels wrong, right? And I realized probably what it is I didn't go quite back far enough on this pose, and that maybe I need this to kind of overshoot a little bit earlier, right? So maybe what I'll do is I'll do something like this one, and then here I will kind of start that process of the upper parts dragging, right? And so really I'm just adding a couple new poses. And I can see the other thing is this rotates and then kind of locks there, right? So I really want that to keep going up. So if I'm doing it this way, I have a systematic understanding of each of these poses. And I can just shift all of my keyframes around on this control in order to control those poses, right? So if I have everything selected and I feel like this pose gets there a little too early or a little too late, I can shift all of those keyframes on that pose later, right? I'm just shifting my entire timing now. And that's not always too much to maintain all of those little tick marks, right? Eventually it's still going to get complicated, but that's, for me, easier to maintain is just, I'm shifting that pose. Not a lot of people, some people use another editor in Maya to maintain that. It's actually called the, right here, the dope sheet. A dope sheet is, if you ever see in traditional animation, a dope sheet is how is how traditional animators would mark when certain events happened. And so they would just make like this giant grid, and it was like sort of the numbers of the frames. And so this is kind of in reference to that. And so I can also shift my whole keyframes this way as well to retime stuff. I don't know very many people who actually use the dope sheet that much, but if it works for you, run with it. There's nothing wrong with it. So, all of this is still the blocking phase. All right. From there, we kind of know how to offset stuff, right? After we get all of our key poses in there, then we can change at which point the keyframes happen for certain objects, right? So if I wanted to offset and make it look like this keyframe on this control gets there a little later, I can just shift that one keyframe, right? And I can also control stuff in my graph editor to, in theory, get a better result, right? The same here. Right? Maybe I want to do like this in the graph editor, right? So how you manipulate this from this point on is a little more work inside of the graph editor, but hopefully this will allow you to keep all of your poses together. Only think of this in terms of poses. In most cases, when you're operating any more complex rig, it's going to pay off to work in the pose-to-pose manner and make sure you're keyframing everything. I say that and I recognize that there's a portion of the class who's not going to do that. Like you're just going to be like, nah, I can figure it out. All right, I've only been doing this 15 years. What do I know? Like, trust me, it always just works out for you working in the pose-to-pose way. Okay. So I can kind of sense when class has had enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sort of phase out of the lecture part and start talking about the project. Okay. So if you've already, some of you have probably already found the file up on the network. DIGM classes, Greg, Anim Fund, resources, right here, Bob and Arm. So copy that to your hard drive. And I will tell you, you may need to set your project for this one. I know we haven't done a lot of stuff with textures up to this point, but if I go to File, Set Project, Computer, Bob and Arm, there are some textures in this file that will break if you don't set your project first. So File, Open Scene, and I think it's Rigs. Okay. There we go. So, here are two characters, or at least two parts of characters, right? It's not two full characters, but this is sort of our first attempt at playing around with animating living things, right? This is Bob. Later you'll be meeting Bob. This is Bob Bot. Later you'll be meeting his bigger brother, Ben Bot. And Ben Bot's, I got some better materials for him now, but the way Ben works, or Bob works, I'm sorry, is we got this main controls this, controls how he looks around, right? He has an IK leg. He also has an FK leg. But right now we'll just look at his IK leg. If I move that up and down, it moves, right? He's got a bunch of other options here. This is probably the question I will get most with characters. How do I raise his toe? How do I do things with his toe? Which control you think may control the things on his feet? It's his foot control, right? The only thing is, like, there's not a rotate to rotate his, I mean, there kind of is. There's this thing here, right? But some of these features you're only going to find on that foot control in these extra options here. So toe raise, I can wiggle his toe around, right? Toe swivel, I can swivel his toe around, right? There's a lot of little things in here. And then this arrow is really how you aim his knee. So if you have him squatted and you want him to feel like he's kind of wiggling his knee before he jumps or something, it's kind of got this little wiggle there to it, right? If you look closely, there's actually another control that's kind of hidden in here. It's like a couple of them in here. There's this little blue ring right there. And that will control BenBot's head a little more like separately. And then he also has a tiny little one in there that'll control it a little bit like a neck. So basically it's just got like a head control built onto it, right? I kind of went ahead and left those inside because really just these 4 controls are kind of enough. Now you'll notice this little bitty ring on the bottom, that little purple one down there, right? That's going to move the whole character, okay? That includes the IK, right? So listen closely on this part. If you want to move Bob around the scene, as in he's jumping around the scene, don't use that little purple control. That little purple control is like, I need Bob to start on the top of a mountain. I want to move his whole character over there, right? But once you've moved it, like got him to his starting location, that control really should never move. If you need Bob to jump forward, you move all of the controls that would control that, which is his foot and this, right? And if I move those forward, he can jump around. The reason for that is because if I'm moving this, his IK is going to slide around on the floor, and you kind of lost the whole purpose of having that IK, right? So to kind of show you what I mean quickly here, this. Move that down. This. Push that up. Sorry. Here. There we go. You'll notice that his foot stays where I want it to, right? It doesn't slide around. Can you all see that okay? That's a little bright up there, right? However, if this thing were animating forward that entire time, his foot doesn't stay where I want it to, right? So really just put that purple thing in one location and don't move it around unless you absolutely have to, right? The arm, so we recognize hopefully that this is an IK rig, right? This is Bob's movement is an IK leg, right? This arm is currently set to be FK, which means it can pose through rotation. And it can wave high, right? Okay. I'm going to show you one more really kind of handy thing, okay? Oh, usually my puns are intended. That one wasn't. Oh, I'm happy about it though. I'm glad that worked out. I'm a fan of the pun. So one more quick thing, and this is a really useful skill or trick. I keep telling you to set a keyframe on everything, right? And you'll recognize that this arm has a clavicle, a shoulder, an elbow, a wrist, looks like maybe 2 wrists, a hand control, 4 controls for each finger, right? And so to hold shift and select each of those takes forever, right? Occasionally you can sort of drag select and select everything. And in this case, that will probably work with all of these controls, right? And so that's one way you can do that, is that, right? And now whenever I move this entire rig, hopefully everything will key with it, right? And so I can drag and select it like that, right? But occasionally you'll accidentally select other things. So with Bob, as an example, if I drag select, like it doesn't select everything. It's just selecting his foot control. I honestly don't know why that is. There's something that is hidden, but it's a preference for selection. So when you drag select the whole thing, it's not selecting all of his controls, it's selecting his IK handle. I don't know, it's sort of a glitch in the rig. But I want to show you like a trick to how you can select everything you need to select anyway. So the things that I need to animate on Bob is this control, this control, this control, and this control, right? If I open up my script editor, this little thing in the very bottom corner over here, right below my auto key, can you all see that? Barely, right there in that corner. It's right below the little man with the cog, like right below that. This is our script editor. And when I open this up, this is how I can write little scripts to execute stuff, right? This can be really powerful if you like programming, if you like scripting. This is a lot of what you'll learn to do in TD as well. And it's one of the reasons that, well, at least in the game design concentration, one of the programming classes is a required class, is because you can utilize this to automate a whole bunch of stuff that's really complicated, right? However, I'm not going to teach you to do any scripting. In fact, I'm not even super good at it. But what I am going to do is teach you how to utilize this thing in a way that is useful. Because you'll recognize that whenever I select an object in here, right, if I deselect, look what it says, select-cl-sym. That means I currently have symmetry turned on. Let me go ahead and turn that off. It means that when I deselected this object, it said clear my selection. Right? Select-cl means clear any selection, nothing is selected anymore, right? And so if I were to have that selected, I Control-C that, and paste it down here where it says mel, right, and hit enter, it will execute that command. In fact, you'll notice that when I select that control, it says select-r tsmg _upper _body semicolon, right? So that is that line of text right there is the script to select my character's main control. And so if I paste this in here, highlight that, Control-C, Control-V, if I hit enter on that, it will select my character's body control, right? Which means I can utilize this thing, that all this information that's popping up here, to create the text that I need to select my entire character, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm going to hit Edit, Clear All, so that wipes everything out of there, right? And then I'm going to select each of these controls one at a time while holding Shift. So I'm going to select my top control, hold Shift, select my knee, my foot, and then one right there. So that text right there is going to select all of the keyable parts of my body, or my character that I need to, right? And so I could type all that in, or I could hit Control-C and save that text somewhere. Instead, I'm just going to make a button in Maya that allows me to do this anytime I want to, right? So if I highlight that text, right, and I middle click, drag it, and drop it, well, apparently I switched menus. Drop it right there. It's going to say, what type of script is this? It's a mel script. And you can tell that because we're in the mel menu. Hit mel. And now I have a new button there, right? And whenever I click that button, it will fire off that string of code. So now I've basically made a button that selects my entire character with one click, okay? There are other ways of doing this. You'll also notice that this handy rig over here, they made this nice, useful little selection set in our outliner here that allows us to select everything that is used for the rig, right? And you'll see that when I did that, it made that selection set right there, right? So I can paste that up there. And now I have my two buttons. One selects all of BobBot, one selects all of the arm, right? And so now I can set this in that pose-to-pose way very quickly, right? This is super handy, super useful, and so I strongly encourage you to use this. It's not the only option. There are a couple of scripts out there, a couple of plugins you can download that make easily selectable selection sets. I use one called Anim bot, and eventually that one's a set of scripts that I would encourage you to look into. It's in beta right now. Eventually it'll be not beta, like you'll start charging for it, and it's an incredible set of scripts. So if that's something you're interested in using, it's free out there right now. So, but it has an option to create a whole bunch of buttons for all of your selection sets as well. Okay, let's look at the actual written project. Okay. Scroll down, swinging objects. Here we are, bob and arm, right? So, why are we doing it? This project will help you learn the difference between FK and IK. It will also help you analyze force, weight, balance, overlapping action, the pose-to-pose process, and character and composition for storytelling. So that's the part I'm not going to get super heavy with the lecture, right? Before we start animating anything, we always have to think this is going to eventually show up on a screen. The audience is going to watch it. That's why you're making it, right? Is for the viewer. And so we need to think about cameras, about how we're going to show that, right? So what you're going to do, you're going to animate the bob bot and the arm, and there are only 4 requirements, okay? Requirement number 1, Bob has to jump at least twice. Okay, he has to do at least 2 jumps. That shouldn't be too hard. You all animated the bottle and the ball in the principal's class, right? It's very similar to the bottle and the way the bottle jumped around. 2, the arm must swipe, swing, punch, wave, or gesture at least once, okay? It's really hard to swipe or wave just once. More than likely, you're gonna have a little bit of a settle to that, right? 3, the animation cannot be shorter than 7 seconds long or longer than 10 seconds long. Maybe I need to take out the word long. How about, that makes more sense. The animation cannot be shorter than 7 seconds or longer than 10 seconds, okay? And 4, you must use at least 3 different cameras to tell this story, okay? So this is where I want you to actually start thinking about camera cuts. A lot of times, people are like, I want to be able to see this from the other side, so I'm just going to animate my camera going like all over the place. It's going to spin around the scene 3 times. That way you get to see everything. And I think a lot of times that's because it's easier to set up a keyframe than it is to figure out how to change cameras, right? And so what I would do is, I usually use a spreadsheet or a text document. I say, go into Maya here, right? I'm gonna create cameras, camera 1. I'm gonna look through camera 1, right? And I'll say for camera 1, turn on my screen, this button right here, the blue dot, right? So this is where I'm rendering from. I'll say from camera 1, I'm going to render from frames 1 through 60, right? And then create cameras, camera, perspective, camera 2, camera 2. I will render from frame 61 through 100. And then from camera 3, I would make another camera, and that one would be from 101 through whatever, right? And so you're gonna have to render in 3 batches, right? But they'll be shorter batches, and I think that'll actually make your render time probably a little easier on you, right? There's ways of doing this all in 1 batch render. Right now, I feel like that's probably, like you're ready to start working, not ready to listen to me talk for another 30 minutes. So I'm going to stop talking at that. If you're curious about any of that, I honestly think the easiest way at this point is just to render it out into 3 different folders and edit that together in Premiere. I do that because I recognize that by doing that, I'm making you think about camera early on, right? And no matter how much I can get up on my soapbox and just yell it to the sky, create a camera first and animate to that camera, okay? Your audience is never going to see all of those other camera angles. They're only going to see the camera you choose to show them. That should be one of the first decisions you make, right? And I swear, I yell this in the character animation class like once a day, and I will still, like, the day before they're going to render, I'm like, where's your camera? What's the camera we're looking at this? They're like, I haven't created it yet. And I'm like, then how do you have any idea what you're doing? What are you even animating to, right? So this, I think, is a good exercise in like, you have to create those 3 cameras to even know how you're going to show this, right? So create those 3 cameras. Sometimes it's like, oops, I messed up one of my cameras, what do I do? The open and close bracket keys, if you hit the close or the open brackets, it will undo a camera move. Control Z will not. But what I usually do is after you get your cameras in place, just click this little lock button right there so you don't accidentally move your camera, right? And then you can lock those cameras in place. And you can have all of your cameras viewable at once if you wanted to, right? It's very easy to go in here and just say, this is perspective, this is camera 1, this is camera 2, right? So you can see them all at the same time, or you can set this up in whatever layout works best for you, right? But thinking of all 3 of those cameras is an important part. So let's look at what we got in terms of timeline. So today is the 25th. This will be due at the beginning of class on Tuesday, October 2nd, okay? So that means we have, I think, a week for this. If we go back and look at Tuesday, October 2nd, yeah. Wait. Yeah, that's right. So I have an offset on this. Basically, we're starting that today instead of this table tennis robot. We're starting this on the 25th, and when it will be due is the 2nd. So we have exactly a week, and that's when we're going to sort of start thinking about simulation. So to finish off the rest of this half of the semester, you'll notice that fall break is coming up on the 16th. That's coming up way quicker than, dude, like it just feels like this semester is flying by me. I don't know about you all. So that's cool, but I really hate assigning stuff over fall break, so I really try to split the semester into pre-fall break and post-fall break, right? And so we're going to try to squeeze in another exercise and project before fall break. We'll see what happens. I think that we can do that. The exercise is going to be pretty simple. The project is going to be a little bit open-ended. It's like, this one's kind of fun. The match project, I kind of show you some stuff. I give you some guidelines, and I say, run free and make something neat. Like, that's kind of the way I assign that project. So I think you'll enjoy that one. We'll try to get that one done before fall break. Couple of quick house cleaning notes. I recognize that there's no grades in D2L yet. That is, we're all in this like mad scramble to get our grades in because the early semester progress reports are coming up soon. And this class is one that's on my radar. You will have some grades in there before that. I hope to be able to get everything graded by that point. I think they're going to roll in pretty quickly. The other thing is revisions. If you've gotten feedback during in-class critiques or you want to run stuff by me, you can turn in a revision whenever. So even if you already know something you want to redo on it, just drop that in the revisions folder. I'll check that when I grade it. The third thing is there's going to be an opportunity right before fall break for some extra credit. Now I know, since I don't have any grades yet, you all aren't sure if you want extra credit or not. You probably will. Either way, it's worth it. Midpoint, there's midpoint review, right? The thing that you have to go through. And then there's portfolio. Portfolio is the last class you take where you present your portfolio, right? There is a midterm presentation for portfolio. And I'm going to give you some extra credit points. I need to actually look at the numbers to see how many, but a few extra credit points just to attend that. Okay? Good. Bless you. Go there and check that out because it is very informative about a lot of things. Okay? Has anybody been to portfolio reviews before? Okay. It's a little scary, particularly if you're the person presenting. You have to get up in front of all of the faculty. They're all sitting there in a giant line, being all judgy, right? And so you get up in front of all the faculty, and you say, this is what I've done my time here at ETSU. And you show us your best work, and we critique it. Now, the point of this is to make sure you graduate being ready to go out into the industry and apply to jobs and everything, right? Some people go up there very unprepared, and it's very painful to watch, right? Some people go up there and they've been working their butts off, and what they present is like just inspiring. Like you will watch it and be like, that's awesome, I want to do that. And so it's kind of like recharging your batteries. Like I think it's a great way to go see the entire spectrum, both exactly what you want to be when you get out of this program and exactly what you do not want to happen to you someday, which is standing there while Todd yells, "What have you been doing for 4 years?" That was my best Todd I can muster up. I don't know if that was, but I have heard that exact sentence. What have you been doing for 4 years? You don't want to be at the other end of that question, right? So I strongly think it's a beneficial thing for everybody in digital media to see. That way you know what to try for when you get to that point. I think it's so valuable, I'm willing to give you extra credit points for it. So basically, just by attending, I can give you some extra credit points. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to it. Basically though, it'll be the nights of, it'll actually be right after this class, the week before fall break. So we would basically, I would rush downstairs, grab a water bottle and a cup of coffee, and we would go over to the Millennium Center where we watch. So it's all the faculty, as many students as we can pack into a room, and just by being one of those students for a few hours, you can get some extra credit points. You had your hand up. When is it? Was that
yes, and also, do you know if the animators are first this time, or?
I don't know. I'm one of them. So all the faculty are mentors. So basically, they have to check in with us throughout the semester. And I know that there are 16 people in the class, and 8 of them are animators who chose me as their mentor. So that means about half of the class is animators. I think it's just an animation-heavy semester.
Only 8, and that's heavy?
Yeah, like that, but that's half of all of the people graduating. So, well, for this semester, it's only 16 people in the class. Some semesters, there's like 30-some people in the class.
Oh, in one animation class?
Yeah, well, in the portfolio class.
Oh.
So it's like all the people graduating from digital media this semester. Anyway, what'd you say?
I was gonna ask what the average is.
The average of,
The portfolio, how many people? Like this one's 16.
I think the highest one we've gotten was like 36. It's a very difficult night when it's 36 people because you got to get through 36 presentations in 2 days. This one's 16, so it'll probably be over by 7-ish, 8-ish, something like that every night. And we'll split it up into 2 nights.
I'm just curious, is there a difference between like fall portfolios or portfolio?
Yeah, well, just because like most people enter in the fall, which means most people graduate in the spring.
That's what I was wondering.
Or it feels like most people try to graduate in the spring, so the spring class is always bigger. But this is a relatively small class this semester, but it's animation heavy if you all are interested in animators. And there's some really good ones in there. Anybody know, Catherine Ross came in here and spoke a while back. She's one of them. Like, there's a whole bunch of people who are very solid animators. I think you're gonna see some good stuff, and you're gonna see some people who...
You're gonna see some stuff.
You'll see some stuff, right? It's gonna fly. But I just think it's good practice. The more you see that, the more you know what to expect, and the more you can prepare and have a better presentation yourself, right? It's also the other end of midpoint. Like what you're doing in midpoint is the beginning of this growth cycle toward portfolio. Like usually, whoever you pick as your mentor in midpoint, you're gonna be working with them a lot throughout the semester, all the way up to portfolio. And like it's kind of like, this is the beginning of that journey, portfolio is the end of that journey. And so you'll just have a nice round perspective of it. So, any questions about anything? I know I talk a lot. Gosh, how do you all put up with me? Okay.
My file will open with the spotlight.
Okay.
I said it, but I think I messed it up. Like earlier.
It's one of your seats.
Whoops. I'm sorry.
No, you're cool. Yes.
It's your positive energy and passion.
Is that what it is?
Oh,
It's not my overzealous vocabulary. All right, so the rest of the class is yours, and if that means, God, Marlo, I'm tired of your voice, I'm going to cookout. I understand.
I just want to see my friends.
Okay, fair enough. Yes. Okay. Let me stop this video and get it prepared to upload. So hopefully that video came out well. We'll see how that goes. Hi, video.
Is it called Brand?